Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you might be. My name is Andrew Cutchins. I'm a senior fellow here at the Center for the National Interest, and this online event is part of the Central Asia Connectivity Project that we launched earlier this year here at the center. And the topic for today, we will be looking at the relationship between the Gulf states and Central Asian states and Central Asia and the region overall. Um, this is quite a dynamic set of relationships. 5 years ago, I left Washington to be the president of American University of Central Asia. And even at that time, I'm not sure that I would have identified the Gulf states as such a significant player in Central Asia. Perhaps that was my own ignorance, but there has been a lot of dynamic change in the last 5 years. First off will be Greg Priddy, who is a senior fellow for the Middle East at the Center for the National Interest here in Washington. And then Ted Karasik, who is a senior advisor for Gulf States Analytics, also a consultancy based here in Washington, D.C. And then coming from Prague, we are delighted to have Bruce Pannier, who is a well-known figure to the Central Asian community across the world, as he has been the host of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's weekly podcast, Majlis, for a long time, and as well is the author and editor of the RFE-RL weekly newsletter on Central Asia. So without further ado, let me turn over the floor to Greg.
So I'm going to start out with, just kind of how this, the Gulf perspective and kind of how this looks from the Gulf looking north. And I think, digging into this issue, and I was just looking at some of the trade and foreign direct investment numbers bilateral between the Gulf and the Central Asian states. It's remarkable how modest those sums were up until about 3 to 5 years ago. And in several cases, those bilateral numbers start ticking up at that point. But it's not, given the amount of money in the Gulf, the amount that they have for outbound FDI, it's smaller than you would expect. And so, I'm thinking about what is pulling those up, and what is the pull factor that is making that more interesting. From the GCC perspective, Gulf Cooperation Council, they have been, in a period where everyone is focused on the energy transition and on the need to diversify their economies away from hydrocarbon resources. And so that has pulled them into a lot of investments, both domestic and external, but some of that has increased interest in Central Asia in terms of getting into energy in Central Asia, new energy in terms of renewables, and also increased connectivity with travel with the region. It also, when you look at the last few years since the pandemic, you've had a big surge in oil prices that have gotten back from what had been uncomfortable levels to quite comfortable. And that has meant that they have had more cash to invest. So those outbound flows are coming up in general. Qatar also listed the moratorium on new LNG volumes. So that is going to free up additional money that they're going to have in the future for outbound investment. So, we also have the resolution of the GCC internal dispute with Qatar. And since they've normalized, that has made possible some multilateral fora with the Central Asian states that would not have been possible earlier. In their relations with Central Asia, I think they also, to some extent, see themselves as balancing with Turkey and with Iran, which also have a lot of influence in the region. But Qatar is a little bit different because of their relationship with Turkey, but they're both partners and balancers in some ways. And that's true of a lot of the relationships that are taking place where people have many partners in complex relationships where they're both partner and balancer to some extent. On the Central Asian side, I think that there has been a push to diversify ties the last few years, particularly in energy. Russia has dominated the history of their infrastructure. Russia built that most of what was there pre-existing, and Russian companies have had a dominant role in the region in a lot of things in the energy sector. And so having the Gulfy companies coming in and investing, or Gulf companies like Aqua, for example, coming into the electric power sector and partnering on projects, it makes use of their existing capabilities, but it also helps to diversify their partner base and supplier base for the energy sector that had been very lopsided. This also comes alongside the war in Ukraine. I've seen polling data that has suggested that Central Asian public opinion has tilted a bit against Russia, as a result of what has happened in Ukraine. But also that there is a perception, again, that this is driving a need to diversify their partners and pushing them toward the Arab states of the Gulf, also pushing them a little bit more toward China. This is kind of underscored by the brief but impactful shutdown of the CPC pipeline at the beginning of the war, which it kind of underscores their vulnerability when it comes to over-reliance in Russia. So we've had also a surge of diplomatic activity the last 2 to 2.5 years between the Gulf and Central Asia. There was a ministerial of the GCC and then C5, Central Asia 5, in 2022. Emir Tamim of Qatar visited all of the region except Kyrgyzstan last year. He made a series of visits, last summer. And then also in 2023, we had the summit that was the Central Asia 5 plus the entire GCC meeting at the head of government level. So there's been that really is a level of diplomatic activity that we hadn't seen before, and underscores the importance that they see in building those relationships further. I'm not going to get too far into the sovereign wealth side of this because I think that Ted is going to address some of that. But all of the major GCC sovereign wealth funds have, Central Asia built into their investment plans, and most of them in ways that were more prominent than what they would have said 5 years ago. But again, it's focusing, largely, a lot of that is in the energy sector, and making use of the skill base that they already have in their own oil companies, electric power utilities, et cetera, with a focus both on natural gas and on solar. And beyond economics, they also have a strong shared interest in security when it comes to anti-terrorism. And so that would propel, particularly with ISIS Khorasan out there, would propel more interest in security. And lastly, one kind of broad comment. I think I mentioned that there are a lot of relationships that are both balancing against someone and partnering with them. And there's a web of interconnected relationships. One aspect of this is Russia. So most of the Gulf Arab countries have relatively positive relationships with Russia and wouldn't really want to offend Russia. And there's a sensitivity to not be seen to do something that is undermining Russia. And that's something that I think would come into play in how the GCC states would think about it. But this is also something that doesn't preclude you from making investments there. It just can't be framed in a way that it would. And China is the same. It's a partner. It's also being balanced. But you wouldn't want to do anything that was framed as something that was anti-Belt and Road or anti-China. And with that, I will wrap up my remarks.
Greg, thanks so much. That's an excellent table setter for the discussion. Before I turn to Ted, I just wanted to mention that we have a very informed and diverse, interesting audience there, and we want to include audience in our discussion. And if you want to make a comment or ask a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Okay, Ted, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to build on a couple themes that Greg spoke about. The first real one that I'd like to point out is about the ministerial meetings that the GCC states hold with the Central Asian states at the foreign ministry level. There have been two of these meetings. One of them was in July of 2023, and another one was just on April 15th. So it was just a few weeks ago. With the significance of these meetings is that the Gulf states want to work more closely with the Central Asian states to expand the relationships that Greg was talking about before. But also it is an important marker of where we are in terms of between these regions. They're growing closer together and interacting more than they have in the past. Now, when you talk about the past, they've been involved with each other for 30 plus years to varying degrees. Used to be a lot of illicit behavior. There still is some, but at the same time, there was an interconnectivity between the regions. Nowadays, it's much more front forward. It's dynamic, and the Gulf states are looking for opportunities in which to invest in Central Asia itself. Greg is absolutely right that during the Gulf crisis and even afterwards, 2017 to 2020, these states competed with each other in Central Asia. They also, UAE would compete against Turkey in Central Asia, so on and so forth. It began to become a real game up there from the Gulf perspective. That game has now turned into dividends for the Gulf, although they're small right now. And I think what they're looking at is the long term, particularly coming out of the pandemic and going up to, let's say, 2030. There's a big footnote here about Gaza, Israel, and Khorasan, but we'll get to that in a little bit. I do want to point out here that what they're doing is setting the stage for greater growth of SWIFT investment, particularly the Abu Dhabi SWIFTs, and also from Bahrain, and of course QIA in Qatar. These investments have been relatively low. They're usually in property or in energy and in renewables, as Greg mentioned. Mubadala is up there quite a bit, showing themselves and making solar farms, if you will. But I think here that there's another important point about the networks that are being established in terms of transportation corridors, because between the Gulf and Central Asia, there is this dream for connectors. The development road's very interesting because Azerbaijan has signed on to it as well. And with the visit of the Kyrgyz president and the relationship between Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan with the Azerbaijan and the network that's being established there, I would not be surprised at seeing how Development Road begins to fold into network that's being developed in Iraq. It's a big development. We'll have to remember that this is an MOU. It is supported by Qatar, UAE, and Oman off to the side, and Bahrain, and Kuwait, of course, is very supportive because of the exit at Basra. And what this does is it connects Iraq and Turkey more to the Gulf as well. And that is something that both countries have been searching for in terms of better capability of output, if you will, or throughput. Now, this Discovery Road also, so it runs parallel to north-south. Cutting across it, of course, is the middle corridor, which is supported by Turkey. But let's remember that in the middle corridor, for example, in Georgia, there are dry ports that are owned by Dubai World or DP World. And so DP World is in middle corridor, and Abu Dhabi Ports is involved in Discovery Road, and then also the linkage between Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan for oil tanker transfer when that begins. So the Gulf states have a plan, if you will, for logistical routes and nodes that they can participate in. But here's the important point. It's without alienating Russia too much, because from the Gulf point of view, they do not want to see Russia implode or be affected that has a rollover effect upon their region and hurts their pocketbooks at the end of the day. I think that this is why they are facing east a lot of the time, if you will, when it comes to requests from the West to not deal with Russia. They do this anyway because that's from their point of view. They ignore the orders that are coming from Washington and other European capitals because it's not in their best interest to do so. This is a very difficult issue to deal with because these are authoritarian states, just like in Central Asia. So it's hard for the West to really get these countries to do what they need to do unless you use a lot of sticks and very few carrots. For the U.S., this is really going to be problematic, particularly because of issues involving Israel and Gaza, and also Israel and Iran, because this environment is still a threat environment, and these ideas for logistic lines and so on need de-escalation. So these roads and logistic lines are going to take time. Again, as I said, they're MOUs in some cases, and they might not actually work until 2026 or 27. And by then, we might be looking at a different geopolitical picture anyway between North and South, that is, between Central Asia and the Gulf states. I'll stop there and let Bruce speak at this time. Thank you.
Thanks, Ted. I'm really glad you brought in the aspect of transit routes and potential thereof. Bruce, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you. And of course, thank you to the Center for National Interest for organizing this event. And thank you, Andrew, for getting me in as a participant. Greg already, and so did Ted, mention a little bit about the summits and the ministerial meetings they've had recently. Everything I'm going to talk about is post-February 2022. And I think it's important to point out that these ministerial meetings and the summit are also post-February 2022. So this is a really new development. It kind of shows that the Central Asians are in a situation where they really need to find some new partners for a lot of things at the moment. But certainly one that I would mention would be investment. They need a new trade route. And they certainly are benefiting from the renewable energy projects that the companies like UAE's Masdar or Saudi Arabia's Aqua are currently involved in Central Asia. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But Greg covered diplomacy pretty well. I wanted to add to that a little bit that you can kind of see some other very high profile evidence of this at the moment. Uzbekistan finally opened an embassy in Qatar in December last year, after all these years. The Central Asian presidents are all of them have been to Saudi Arabia on individual state visits since February 2022. A lot of them have gone to the United Arab Emirates. The Kazakh president was just in Qatar in February for the first ever visit of a Kazakh president. We already heard that the Qatari Emir was in Central Asia last year too. So these are the signs of the warming relationship between the two regions at the moment. The Central Asians, I look at Central Asian press all the time. The way they describe the relations with the Middle East countries, with the Gulf Arab countries, is much deeper and much warmer than it was 10 years ago, for example. So you can see that it's a developing friendship that they have. I mentioned a little bit about investment. China, traditionally, for the last 20 years, most of the Central Asian investment has been coming from China. Russia, when it's flush with cash, has gone in every now and then too. The EU, of course, was a major trade partner of Kazakhstan for a long time, but it's really been China that's been, every time a Central Asian leader goes to China, you're waiting for the announcements of how many $1 billion of deals they signed out there. No one else signed those kind of deals with the Central Asians for a long time. I mean, it was really just China. But now China is in a different situation. One, because some of the Central Asian countries have gone into so deep into debt with China that they can't possibly pay back the money that they owe. In any case, all the Central Asian states are a little bit wary of incurring any more Chinese debt at the moment. And China itself is not in a great economic situation. They can't really afford to be giving out money to countries, especially when they know that the chances of being repaid anytime soon are pretty small. So this is a dilemma for the Central Asian governments. They have to keep their own economies going. They have to make improvements, move forward. So where are you going to turn? Now, clearly they have turned to the Arab states, and I'll give you a couple of numbers just to give you evidence of that. First, I'll mention that last year, the top 5 investors in Uzbekistan, Saudi Arabia was 3rd, and the United Arab Emirates was 5th. If you look back just a few years, you won't find either of those countries in the top 5 at all. When I had mentioned that the Kazakh president, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, was in Qatar, he started to negotiate, or his delegation started to negotiate deals which were signed off on by the prime minister last month when the Kazakh prime minister went to Qatar. $17.6 billion worth of deals, right? Now, this is Chinese kind of money for the Central Asians. They don't see that kind of money coming across. So, and it was interesting what the deals were involved in too, because I'd mentioned renewables, and I'll get back to that again in a minute. But some of these deals were for 2 major domestic gas pipelines in Kazakhstan, which they need for gasification. That was $12 billion just for those 2 pipelines. And Qatar is also going to help them build a gas processing plant to handle the gas from the offshore Kashagan gas and oil field, which is a major field. And again, this is for an Arab country to be coming in and doing the kind of investments which were more familiar with companies like Chevron or Lukoil or CNBC or somebody like that getting involved in. So this is a big step. When Uzbek President Shavkat Mirziyoyev was in Saudi Arabia in August 2022, he was there, and they signed a package of deals worth $13.1 billion. Almost all of those are for renewable energy, but again, just a number pops out at you because they don't see that kind of number. I don't want to say anything bad about the European Union. They've done a lot of good work there, but the United States gets the same rap as not having invested enough in Central Asia. Well, the EU just came up with a 10 billion euro package for Central Asia. But if you remember the numbers I just said, $17.6 billion and $13.1 billion, I mean, these are from just individual countries. So if you're in Central Asia and you're looking at this, you can sense that there's a shift in who's doing business in Central Asia at the moment. We've already heard a little bit about renewables, but I do want to mention that Masdar and Aqua have been coming on strong. Aqua had a kind of minimal presence in Uzbekistan and really not many other places. Same with Masdar. They weren't a big player 5 years ago, right? Now in the last 2 years, they have become major players. Aqua said that after Saudi Arabia, Uzbekistan is its largest market at the moment. Masdar said recently that it has invested, its investment portfolio is $4 billion in Central Asia. Again, these are big numbers for the Central Asians. And what they're doing, the projects they're involved in, aside from the gas pipeline I mentioned and the processing plant, but the renewable energy is perfect timing because Central Asia is going through severe problems from climate change at the moment. There's been drought 3 straight summers, and it looks like there's going to be drought again this summer, despite the fact that large areas of Central Asia are flooded at the moment. They're still saying that there's going to be drought again. A lot of the projects that Russia or China are involved in are coal-fired thermal power plants that are polluting the air all over. So clean energy, renewable energy, these are things that the Central Asians are really looking much closer at these days because they see the problems that they're having at the moment. They understand that traditional means of generating electricity and power are becoming obsolete very quick and unsustainable for Central Asia. So, it's great timing for the Arab states to come in and get involved specifically in these kind of projects in Central Asia. And the last thing I want to mention, and this is what, again, Ted was just talking about this and Greg's mentioned it too, is connectivity. The Central Asians have been looking for this north-south trade route. They wanted to trade with the South since they became independent in late 1991. Unfortunately for them, they border Afghanistan and Iran. Now, Afghanistan, for obvious reasons, is not a route that you can use, a reliable route that you can use to go south. Iran has had problems, geopolitical problems. It's under sanctions since before the Central Asian states even became independent. So it's been difficult to try to get a trade route that can connect them solidly, reliably to the Persian Gulf. Abu Dhabi Ports Group has been working with the Kazakhstan, especially, to develop the port in Kurik on the Caspian coast, working with Iran to get the route through, and they've just signed deals too, where they're saying that they can get goods from Kazakhstan, from Kurik, all the way to the Persian Gulf in 3 days, and then on to ports in the UAE if they want, but that's pretty good, 72 hours to get goods from Kazakhstan all the way down, which is also interesting because we see that Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates are also investing in food processing plants in Central Asia too. So dairy products, meat, grain, things like that. So the fact that they're having faster shipping time and that they're investing in these projects also shows that the Gulf states are looking at Central Asia as potential supplier of food for them going forward into the future, and are working to develop the routes. I'd mentioned Abu Dhabi Ports Group as developing the ports, but they're also working with the Kazakh State Railway Company to improve efficiency and get goods quicker and unloaded quicker in the ports on the Caspian coast. So, I mean, we see it across the board. In some ways, it echoes Belt and Road, what I was just describing, where the Arab states are coming in and investing in projects in Central Asia, some of which are benefiting the Arab states, and they're helping develop the route to bring it to the Arab states so that it gets there in a timely fashion. And like I said, that's something that we've seen China do for the last 20 years too. So I'm going to leave it there so that we can get into the discussion, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bruce, and all three of you. There clearly really is a there, and the so-called there has dramatically grown in the last few years. It's a really dynamic picture. We have a couple of comments from our friend Ed Chow. I'll turn to in a moment, but I wanted to turn to one topic that none of you had mentioned, and to what extent is common religion and culture driving these relationships?
You know, yes, it provides a basis, another basis for them to cooperate because they all are Muslims. You know, Bukhara is a famous city in Islamic history for a long time, up there with the biggest of them. You know, at the same time, the Central Asians, I think one of the things that hindered Arab cooperation with Central Asia for so long is that remembering that the Central Asian leadership all comes from the Soviet communist heritage. And so the idea of a country that's a government that's closely connected with religion is alien to them and also threatening at the same time. And I think this is a big problem. While the trade and business relations are growing very fast, you don't see any talk about Central Asia sending people to study in the madrasas in the Middle East, and you won't either. They were studying there for a while. They recalled them all from there because they didn't want them way out of the eye of the government studying who knows what in madrasas and Egypt, Turkey, and let alone Saudi Arabia and those places. So while it does provide a basis for them to get together and they have a common religion, the Central Asians are only willing to let that play a limited role in their relationship, at least at the moment, with the Arab states.
Thanks. Ted, you wanted to jump in on this?
I think that, yeah, I think these countries have a lot of mirror imaging in terms of their societies and how they function in terms of family units and businesses, interest groups, and so on. I think that tends to pull them together. But nowadays, those relationships are still very important, but there's a greater push towards what I would call religio-cultural exchange. It's not religion, it's culture, and it's about adhering to cultural norms and so on with religious overtones. and you'll see groups going from the Gulf to Central Asia to do what we would call maybe in the old days proselytizing, but actually it's not, so to speak. It's more about the cultural aspect of Islam. So I think that this is, or Islam light, I think some of this is acceptable to the Central Asian authorities because obviously they allow these groups to come there from the Gulf. But as Bruce said, no one from the region from Central Asia is going to study at a religious seminary in the Gulf. That just doesn't happen. So this is more of a cultural and soft power outreach, in my view, that's actually been quite effective sometimes in binding together certain communities and bringing them in to the Gulf to see Gulf culture and so on. It helps to build bridges and community building. It has a lot to do with politics as well, because it helps to spread models around. The Gulf model of society, if you will, is something that they see as that can be useful for Central Asian society because they feel that they understand it. I don't think the feeling goes the same way, but as Bruce mentioned also, if their Central Asian states are talking more about how wonderful the Gulf is, and it's and doing intellectual articles about it, if you will, this is a very positive development. It shows that interconnectivity when it comes to that cultural issue. I see when I was there in the Gulf, I had students that were, I taught in a couple of universities while I was there, and students from Central Asia were always very, very good. They were well educated, but they had good bases. A lot of them had a mix of both a local Russian education, if you will, but also maybe because some of the kids were of the elites, which is a factor here, of course. They had some schooling also in Europe too. So they were more able to function in that society. So it's that back and forth also in the education sector between the two regions that's important, that helps to teach values and so on. I'll stop there for now.
Just one data point about this, and this is Greater Central Asia. The former American University of Afghanistan, well, it's still called the American University of Afghanistan, which of course had to move out of Kabul a couple of years ago. They're now based in Doha, which is an interesting development. When I was running AUCA in Bishkek, we had some collaboration work going on with them. Let's turn to we've got four comments. Let's first turn to Ed Chow's Ed now has three comments. The first two have to do with the transit routes, and it's a question I have as well. Who is going to build all this new infrastructure since neither the Gulf nor Central Asian states have the capacity to do it by themselves? Turks, Chinese, I mean, that has been somewhat addressed, but Ed's next comment is Chinese money never really went to Central Asian countries. It went to Chinese companies that built projects in Central Asia. Arab money is real cash invested in projects that presumably Central Asians will control. His last point was, what language do they speak when the two sides meet? English? I might, just to add on to Ed's comments, and we'll turn next to Elvira's Aidarkanova's question to Ted. But to what extent is there coordination going on between China and the Gulf states on these connectivity projects? I mean, several of you I think all of you made the point at some point that the Gulf states are very sensitive to not wanting to ruffle the feathers of Russia. But what about their interests with China? How coincident are those when we look at Central Asia?
I don't think that it's in conflicts with China's interests at all. Especially given the nature of the political situation in the Gulf, and we see right now too. That with the Red Sea and Houthis, that having an alternate route that runs through the middle of Asia and goes down south to the Gulf. That's a more secure route, probably looking long term. So I don't really see that the Chinese would have any problem with that particular route. I don't think they're going to fund it. But then again, there's a number of other projects that kind of feed into this. A Belt and Road is one, but the CAREC, the Asian Development Bank's Central Asia Economic Regional Cooperation project that's been more than 25 years now or something. They've laid the infrastructure for a lot of these corridors already. Belt and Road is added on to that. There's other projects that have done this too. So, a lot of the basic infrastructure is already in place. It's just a matter of expanding it to this point. And that requires not huge investment, I would say, from anybody. The Arab states will certainly put up probably the bulk of it, but a country like Kazakhstan has the financial means to put in some money to get this too, especially seeing that it benefits them. I'll leave it there.
When it comes to Arab money going to Central Asia, it's going into the company that is constructing the segment that needs to be made. Bruce is absolutely right. A lot of this infrastructure is already there, so this is kind of like modernization and band-aids, if you will, to bring about greater connectivity in plans that had been thought about for many years. The Arab money goes into central bank funds and then goes into to the construction company that's been subcontracted. There is a lot of due diligence that's done on this type of activity, both definitely from the Arab side. They definitely look at what they're about to get into, and they sometimes work with Chinese partners because they have Chinese construction companies in the Gulf states building all their own infrastructure. So there's a lot of deals that go on between the Gulf states. I'm making some generalization here, between the Gulf states and Chinese companies when it comes to construction. They have many of the buildings that you see, for example, in Dubai, or that infrastructure such as highways, were all built by Chinese construction companies. It's the same Chinese construction companies we see in from Algeria to Tanzania to all the way down to the southern coast of Africa. These companies, the Chinese construction companies, do indeed build a debt trap, though, into some of this. But when it comes to Gulf Arab money, we don't see that phenomenon because, of course, the Gulf states really control the contract. They're the ones who are making the deals with the Chinese, not the other way around. So we have to remember where the authority is in these kinds of transactions, because I think the Gulf drives a lot more of this investment than the Chinese do. I think they bring the Chinese in when they can. And if the Chinese are creating a security issue, like we've seen in a few instances, those are dealt with on a case-by-case basis. The languages that they speak is basically through translator. It's in Russian, although, some of the leaders do speak. If they speak Dari, then they'll be able to communicate in Arabic. It's that kind of barely get through switch over. And then I'm sorry, I just have to lower this. I can't see the rest of your question. Well, we understand that it's not module. Is it still worthwhile is this project worthwhile to invest in? The middle core. Well, we understand that the Trans-Caspian corridor is the most strict. I think the Trans-Caspian corridor, all of them have their benefits, to be sure. The issue here to me is really about what is seen as being against Western sanction actions or what can be approved and outside of sanctionable actions. I think that's the cost here. Now, the cost for connecting to the corridor, let's say from a northern Levant to the Caucasus, is definitely going to be of a certain cost. But you have 3 major Gulf states who are signed up for this project as a way to solidify and stop fighting between Turkey and Iran and Iraq and so on, and at the same time be able to deal with the Caucasus. And as you know now and have seen, there's been a change in the Caucasus this past week with Armenia and Azerbaijan. That's extremely important in terms of the division of how Armenia and Azerbaijan are going to be part of these transportation networks, especially Middle Corridor. Iran is starting to make a move to be more part of perhaps the Middle Corridor if it can get a sanctions waiver. A lot of this is still up in the air, I think, in terms of the Iranian question, but because it's in play right now. But I think that we're going to see more of a push towards developing this discovery road between the 2 regions, because it brings, from the Gulf mine at least, jobs and helps improve social stability. That's the way that they're looking at these projects. They're projects to help recover from the pandemic and to be able to move goods and services quickly. Bruce's point about food security is super important, because the Gulf states have always had at the top of their list of threats to their survival is food supply. And for the past 2 decades or so, the Gulf states have had various projects in South Asia and in East Africa, where they bought land to grow food, to grow grains and so on, so that they had more land, if you will, that they could harvest to bring food to them. Now their objective has changed. They now want to bring food out of Central Asia, not only for themselves, but for global distribution, because from their point of view, they see themselves as the center of the world. When I give a briefing, when I give briefings, I tell people, remember, now the Gulf states are very powerful. They see themselves as peer competitors, if you will, because of their sovereign wealth fund power. So if you're writing a paper, it's going to be about Saudi Arabia and the world, or UAE and the world, or Qatar and the world, all 3 different models. But now they're beginning to work more closely together because of the crises that we're facing in the region. I'm sorry, I went off a little bit there, but it's all relevant. Thank you for your questions.
Thanks, Ted. Greg, do you want to chime in on any of this?
Hey, one other, just going back to Ed's question about the construction contractors. I mean, Chinese companies have a lot of that work, but Turkish companies in that region, as well as in the Gulf, are often involved in and cost competitive in that work. So they've been taking an increasing market share too. But I think I was just thinking about that in terms of the warming relations between Turkey and the GCC states in the last couple of years. That probably removes a bit of a barrier to that. So that's probably good for the Turkish construction companies.
I have a couple of questions I want to put to you that have to do with security in Central Asia, and the first one is water security. I mean, you mentioned there's been some discussion of energy security and development of renewables and other energy projects. But from a security standpoint, I've always looked at water as security problem number 1, number 2, and number 3 for Central Asia. And to what extent are the Gulf states, who also, live in a fairly water scarce region, what is there much connectivity and work being done together there? And the second question has to do with the other aspect of security, and that being, what we just saw in Moscow at the Crocus City Hall, and the porousness of the Tajik Afghan border. Is this an area where the Gulf states see a potential role for themselves?
A partial answer on the water security side. I don't see a huge amount of commonality with those issues because, in the Gulf, you have a substantial amount of the population of some of those countries that is dependent on desalinated water, which is very energy intensive and very expensive. But that's, so they're really on kind of different systems. And a lot of the Gulf is also dependent on aquifers, which I don't think is really, the issue of depleting aquifers under the peninsula, but it's very different than Central Asia.
Thanks. Anything from Bruce? Ted?
Well, I'll start with the water and then I'll go to terrorism. So, because you had two questions here. The first part about water security, I'd have to agree with Greg. I know maybe Bruce has seen something different from the Gulf, but I don't see a lot of water-related technology or hydroponics or vertical farming type escapades in Central Asia that are being sponsored by Gulf states or businesses located in those states. There might be a few of them there, but they might be more private. So water as a topic to work on, I think is not there right now, but it could be in the future. Clearly, though, they're interested in weather-related and climate change issues after the deluge that hit Dubai last week. But this is part of overall climate change that you see across the Arabian Peninsula. Perhaps there'll be opportunity, there already is, to do climate change related programs, but related to water security. I know there's a lot of work on Afghanistan and so on, but there might be more opportunity here because of the lessons learned, for example, in the Gulf as they get hit by these storms and discover, well, we're not set up right for this kind of flooding and so on. That flooding actually is a really good model, fluid dynamic model, if you will, that you could apply also to Kazakh flooding as well. So how can these countries work together in flood and dam control? Because actually the Emiratis, the Omanis, and so on, they have mountains on that divide their country. There's wadis with huge amounts of water that flow through them. There might be some technology sharing there in terms of dams. We can't forget too that the South Asian countries like Pakistan and India have interest in Central Asia as well. They might be in this line of business as well. So water security, I think, is something that will come up more and more, or needs to come up more and more. In terms of Khorasan and Islamic State, etc., the fact that this attack occurred and that the Russians are blaming Ukraine is very typical of Moscow, because it's the same language that was used years ago when, if you ever hear Wahhabi and Bandera in the same sentence, you better get ready for something crazy. And that's exactly what they did. So they have a terrorism threat. They've talked about it for a long time. This is a pet peeve of Petrushev's, and he is very involved with his counterparts, not only in Central Asia, but also in South Asia, regarding the going after this group. It's not easy, and it's going to be problematic for a while. This Khorasan also, of course, serves as a model for many other groups that we find scattered throughout the region. The Gulf states themselves see Khorasan as a threat. They used to see it as a threat before, and now they're seeing it again. So it would not be surprising to me that they would have that they're watching for signs that Khorasan might hit something in the Arabian Peninsula because of proximity issues. So this is an issue that unifies, if you will, or brings together Central Asia and the Gulf states more on that CT level. They do share exercises. They do sell equipment. But if there's going to be something more serious done in terms of going after Khorasan, I don't think we've seen it yet. And that might only come after something terrible happens to a different audience. And that's the reactive policy that we really can't have in this environment. So some more thinking needs to go into this issue. I'll stop there and turn it over to Bruce.
Bruce.
Yeah, concerning the water issue, I mean, I agree 100%. I don't see, there's actually not that much outside interest in helping Central Asia with the water issues. Most of it is coming from Europe or the West, and of the Middle East countries that are helping them out, it's Israel that's been, really since independence, helping them with water conservation, drip farming, things like that. But I don't see that the experience of the Arab countries will help the Central Asians that much. Concerning ISKP, this is interesting. The Central Asians, Tajikistan, of course, is an outlier in the relationship with the Taliban. The other Central Asian countries have established a business understanding with the Taliban. It's totally founded on, like I said, business and trade. That's it. They don't mess with their with the Taliban's politics. They don't want to engage with them on that at all. So I think that they're really counting on the Arab states to help them out. Countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia have ties to the Taliban. They have a line of communications that the Central Asians not only don't have, but aren't even seeking to have. So when there's a concern about terrorism in Central Asia, or some non-state actor, ISKP, when there's a concern like that, that is a threat to both the Arab states and the Central Asians, sure, they talk about it, but I think the Central Asians are going to lean on the Arab states a lot more, understanding that they can influence Taliban politics and security policies within Afghanistan far more than the Central Asians can or want to. So I think that's really the important connection. At least another important connection Central Asia has with the Gulf states is when they perceive a threat, they're going to turn to the Gulf states and say, "Can you tell us what you're hearing from Kabul, from your partners there, and can you send this message or ask them some way to do this particular, engage with this particular policy to help our situation?"
Okay, we're coming to a close. There are a couple of other questions. One, I would like to hear a bit more from the panel about Gulf states' relations with Afghanistan in a broader perspective, and how where it relates to Central Asia. One of the projects we're working on here is an analysis of the Kosh Tepe Canal that the Taliban is building in Afghanistan, which is going to divert a lot of water from the Amu Darya River that would normally be of use for the Uzbeks and other downstream states. From Yasser Sari, one question: which major power can benefit from Gulf Central Asian state cooperation, close relations more? And the second question: how does Gulf Central Asian states' relations may have an impact on Iran, especially with their relations with Iran? Iran is the shortest connection between these two regions. So I will turn it over to the three of you to make some concluding remarks, and your thoughts, and also what to really look out in the future, the next year or two, in these sets of relationships. We'll go in reverse order of how we started. So Bruce, we'll start with you, then go to Ted, and conclude with Greg.
Okay, yeah, of the big powers, who benefits the most from close Gulf Central Asian cooperation? This is going to depend on how you look at this. If you're looking at this from Washington, then your view is anything that pries Central Asia further away from Russia is a good thing. It really doesn't matter which direction they're headed. I don't see that the U.S. benefits directly from this, but again, if you're looking at it from the point of view of ensuring that the Central Asians remain sovereign and independent from Russia, then certainly that's something. Probably China, just because of the trade routes, and also because this gradually does start to normalize at least trade in transit through Iran, which is something that China would like to see. Again, they need an alternate route. They can't do everything on maritime. There's, the Malacca Straits and problems. What would happen if there was a serious conflict? Could they shut down the maritime routes between China and some of these other places? So it's good to have an inland route. And I think, it also helps Iran kind of pry itself a little bit out from the situation that it is, that people will start to recognize that it's an important link on this transit route between east and south and southwest. And there's a role for Iran to play in this, and an important role too. And that really is something that Central Asians and the Gulf states are going to will be the drivers of if it comes to fruition.
Thanks. Ted.
Thank you. In regards to the question, which major power can benefit, I'm going to say Turkey, because because Turkey's the big 800-pound gorilla in the room when it comes to the Mediterranean, Africa, and Central Asia. And I think that we need to pay very close attention to Turkish plans. We've already seen them a lot in terms of Turkic outreach to the region. And as we know, this is not new. We saw it in 1992 and 93. But in this modern day form, it's very potent. It comes with construction companies, and they compete against Chinese interests in these states. So that provides an opportunity for some of the Gulf states in order to, should have made this point before, about how the Gulf states can play China off of Turkey for a construction contract. And they will do that because they're Khaliji Arabs and they think in that manner. Now, speaking of Khaliji Arabs, that's how they also kind of deal with Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is a tribal society, if you will, and they're all tribal societies too at the end of the day. And I would argue that each Gulf state has their own relationship, historical relationship with the traders of Afghanistan, the UAE being one of the leading countries where you would find Afghan interests, particularly of the Haqqani network, because Haqqani kept a lot of his cash there, or they kept their cash there. And it's important to recognize, too, that in the early days of talking to the Taliban, and I'm talking about 2011, 2012, this was being done out of the UAE because of their relationship with the Taliban at the time. Nowadays, the UAE is in a very good position in Afghanistan vis-a-vis the government there, as is Qatar, as is all of the Gulf states. They all have pretty good relations with the Taliban government. They're supportive of it in terms of financial aid, running airports, trying to integrate them, and so on. And part of this atmospherics, if you will, is tied to, of course, the relationship between the Gulf states and Iran, because Iran and Afghanistan, of course, are there. And Iran is another 800-pound gorilla that the Gulf states have to deal with. and they need to have a balanced relationship with Iran and the Taliban in order to really have success. Now, being collegiate, they can kind of play one off of each other. But given current events since October of last year in the region and the missile and drone exchanges that are going on in different parts of the theater, the Gulf states want to be more careful with how they're approaching Afghanistan so they don't invite a hit from someone else, but also to work with Iran more about regional issues. And because, again, as I said before, these countries are saying it's Kuwait in the world or Qatar in the world and Oman in the world. They think that they can settle this themselves, and they really do not want outside interference. So that means that the Gulf states will work more closely with the Central Asian states on the Afghan file because it's their neighborhood. It's a direct in principle impact for their policy. I'll stop there. Thank you.
So I agree with Bruce's points about the United States. Given that the U.S. is playing what relative to China and Russia is a weak hand there, but I think the biggest point would probably be relative to its size and heft at least would be Turkey. Turkey has a lot to win from this. And on the business side, particularly with Gulfy money flowing in, but the Gulf states not having the engineering firms and construction firms and such to go physically do all of that, and some incentives to try not to be overly dependent on China, Turkey gets sucked into that, and Turkey is going to definitely have a cost advantage over Western or European companies doing that. So I think that Turkey probably is the relative winner.
Well, thank you. Greg, did you want to make any other concluding remarks? Are you?
Well, that was the main one. One just follow-up remark would be that with the Turkish lira as depressed as it is, that's bad in a lot of ways, but that also strengthens the advantages that I just talked about. So it's kind of a silver lining for where they are. Helps pull them out of that economic slump possibly.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This has been a really stimulating and interesting discussion, illuminating a lot. I have to say that the numbers on these deals that have been signed by different Gulf states with different Central Asian states is quite eye-catching, and really actually quite a bit more has changed in the last 5 years than I had realized myself. So thanks to Ted, to Bruce and Greg for your terrific remarks and insights in this discussion. And thanks also to our audience and the questions raised and points made. There's one last point from Steve Benson, who was quite bullish on the middle corridor and sees the potential for it to overtake maritime trade. We'll see. All right. Thank you, everybody, and look forward to seeing you in about a month when we reconvene for our next online event for the Central Asia Connectivity Project here at the Center for the National Interest. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Everybody take care.
Yeah.
Thank you.